Histobiograph.
There was no bloodshed, no sword drawn, no trial held, and no one cried for her. And of Cleves was the only wife of Henry VIII who wasn't executed. But her death was perhaps the quietest in royal history. If you've ever believed that survival means victory, stay with me until the end. This story might change everything you thought you knew, and came to England as a political gift. A German girl who didn't speak the language. She carried the hope of peace between two kingdoms. But she wasn't welcomed with honor. Not by the people, not by the nobles, and certainly not by the man meant to be her husband. Henry believed in her portrait. He saw grace, softness, and quiet femininity. But when he met her in person, his smile disappeared. "I cannot tolerate her," he said. From that moment, Anne's fate was sealed in silence. There was no wedding night, no tender touch, no words of affection, no real conversation, just awkward banquets, and eyes that refused to meet hers. She was queen, only by name. No one ever called her that from the heart, and sat alone in vast, empty halls. She wore royal robes no one noticed. She dined in silence, but was expected to smile. She became a shadow in a royal play where she was never given a line. Then one day, a young girl appeared. Her name was Catherine Howard. Beautiful, charming, English. With just one look, Henry was enchanted. Weeks later, he ordered the marriage with and annulled. His reason: they had never consummated the union, and agreed. No tears, no anger, because she knew stepping away from the throne was kinder than being buried in silence. Many called her the lucky one, the only wife who lived beyond Henry VIII. But to live on and be forgotten, is that really living? When Anne died, there was no national mourning. No one wore black. No grand tomb. Only one quiet line in the records of history. Anne of Cleves died peacefully, but a death no one remembers. Can that ever truly be called peace? Every morning, Anne of Cleves woke to the soft sound of chapel bells ringing in the distance. She dressed herself in layers of royal silk, carefully combed her hair in the way a queen of England was expected to, then stepped out of her room, knowing no one was truly waiting for her. In name, she was the wife of Henry VIII. But during every banquet, every ceremony, and every royal gathering, the words queen and were never spoken with ease. New maids often called her the German lady, and no one ever corrected them. Henry VIII never insulted her openly. He did something far colder. He simply acted as if she were not there. When the court planned the spring hunt and was not invited, when the Spanish ambassador came to dine, the seat beside the king was given to another noblewoman. Silence can be more painful than any insult, and began to see the truth. Her presence had become something inconvenient. She was not loved. She was not hated. She was not accused of any sin. She was simply invisible. One afternoon, while walking through the west garden of the palace, and overheard two young ladies talking nearby. One of them asked, "What do you think the new queen will be like?" The other replied, "I just hope she isn't like Lady Anne. No one knows what to do with someone who isn't a wife, but also isn't a widow," and stood still among the half-trimmed rose bushes. She did so without hesitation. She asked for no money. She demanded no titles. She did not try to hold on. The court praised her for her humility. When Catherine Howard was named the new wife of the king, there was no farewell, no speech, no ceremony for Anne. She quietly moved to a small estate gifted by the king. Some say she smiled softly as she left the palace. "At least now I know who I am." In the years that followed, Anne received occasional letters from the king. Sometimes, someone would send her a small gift, a painting of the countryside, a simple piece of jewelry, but her name was never spoken again in the halls of court. She became a ghost in England's memory, a woman who once wore the robes of a queen, but never truly wore them in the hearts of others, and did not cry out. She did not fight. She did not break the silence. She simply stepped out of the picture and left behind an emptiness that no one dared to look into. On the day Henry VIII proposed to annul their marriage, he did not look Anne in the eyes. The message was sent through a courtier, along with carefully chosen words, saying the marriage had never been consummated, that it might be better to live as brother and sister, that she would be given a noble title and a private estate, and read the letter, then folded it with both hands. She asked nothing. There was no anger, no protest, no surprise. The next day, she signed the annulment. No demands for compensation, no negotiations. A soldier escorted her from the palace, but no one stood to watch her go. There was no farewell ceremony, no choir, no royal send-off. Only a few servants, quietly watching the figure of a woman who had once been a queen. She did not leave England. She did not return to Germany. She did not write to condemn the king. She never revealed a single truth from behind the palace walls. Instead, and accepted the title the king's sister, a title that had never existed in any royal court before. No one truly knew what she was. In the order of the crown, no longer a wife, not a queen, not a consort. She was something in between. Henry gave her an estate at Hever Castle, a place once owned by the Boleyn family. Ironically, it had been the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, the king's second wife, one and had been beheaded, another and had been forgotten. From that estate, and of Cleves began a strange new life. She had no power, no love, but she also had no fear. She could go hunting if she wished. She could host her friends. She could read books, plant flowers, write to her sister in Cleves, and sometimes she was invited back to royal events, a quiet symbol of Henry's so-called mercy. But whenever she appeared, people mistook her for a foreign noblewoman. No one greeted her as a former queen. No one spoke of the old marriage. It was as if the court had made a silent agreement to forget what had never truly belonged. Some say she was the wisest among the 6 wives because she lived, but living sometimes is just another form of dying. For some, death comes with a single blow. For Anne, it came little by little, through eyes that looked away, through words never said, through the silence of those who no longer spoke her name. And when Catherine Howard was executed, when the sound of the blade echoed once more across the Tower courtyard, people began to look at Anne differently. She was the woman who had passed through Henry's life and still remained, and said nothing. She placed a bouquet of flowers at the castle gate, then turned and walked away. No one knew if she grieved for Catherine. No one knew what she felt. They only knew, when the cold returned, she never went back there again. After the death of Catherine Howard, the royal court was once again covered in shadows. King Henry aged quickly. He grew heavy, tired, and bitter. His former wives were all either dead or erased from the life of the court. All but one. And of Cleves, the woman everyone had forgotten, was still alive. She lived quietly at Hever Castle, surrounded by woods, moss-covered walls, and the calls of wild birds. And then, something no one expected happened. The king invited her back to court. It was not for marriage. It was not out of affection. It was simply because Henry had no one left to display the image of a stable monarchy, and appeared at a Christmas banquet in the year 1546. Just 1 year before Henry's death, she sat a few seats away from him, not close, but not completely ignored. For the first time in nearly a decade, she was called Lady and the voice that spoke it carried no scorn. Henry looked at her, but said nothing. They sat in silence, surrounded by harp music and the hollow laughter of nobles. 2 people, once husband and wife, now living statues in a crumbling play of power. After that night, and returned to Hever once more. No one invited her again. No one spoke her name. Only time remained, and her name, fading slowly from the mouths of those who survived. In 1547, Henry VIII died, and did not attend the funeral. She was not invited. Instead, she sent a piece of hand-stitched black cloth, embroidered with tiny crosses, placed inside a birchwood box. It was delivered to the palace, quietly. And then, time moved on. Queen Mary took the throne. Then Elizabeth. Both had known and as children, but she was never formally summoned by either of them. She became a symbol of not belonging. A former wife, not quite loved, not quite hated. A wound that did not bleed, but also never healed. And lived until the year 1557, 7 years after Henry's death, 11 years after the last time the court had spoken her name. When she died, there was no state funeral, only a quiet burial at Westminster Abbey. A short inscription was carved into the stone, without the word Queen. Her death did not change history. It did not alter a dynasty. It did not inspire a poem, a song, or a speech. But that death left behind a quiet truth. When a woman lives too long and never truly lives as the title she was given, then even time cannot repair what was once forgotten. In the year 1557, on a gloomy July day, Anne of Cleves took her final breath at Chelsea. There were no family members at her bedside. No royal physicians stood watch. Only an elderly maid, a woman who had been with her since the first days she arrived in England, held her frail hand and whispered, "You are the strongest woman I've ever known." Death came to and without violence. There was no tragedy, no blood, no tearful ending like the other wives of Henry. But it was the silence of it that made it the most heartbreaking of all. For nearly 2 decades after leaving the throne, and never appeared in public as a queen, her face was not painted in any court portrait. No chapel bore her name, and the history books refer to her only as the annulled wife. Westminster Abbey, the place where she was buried, was once the resting ground of kings and queens. But the stone marker at Anne's grave is so modest, it feels out of place. There is no crown, no title of queen, only the simple inscription, Anne of Cleves, died 1557. To some, it was a sign of humility. To others, a symbol of rejection. A dynasty that refused to acknowledge the woman who once wore its highest title. No mourners came. There were no grand tributes. Only a few villagers, quietly placing white flowers at her grave, because she was kind to us once. While England was busy with political unrest under Queen Mary, no one noticed that one of Henry VIII's wives had passed away. No headlines, no official announcements, no eulogy. The death of Anne was the death of a faded memory, a soft reminder from history that not everyone who survives is remembered, and sometimes those who weren't beheaded are the ones forgotten first. Years later, during a restructuring of the abbey, Anne's tomb was quietly moved to a far corner of the church. No one protested. No one rewrote the record. No one stepped forward to defend her place. The world turned its back on her one last time. And because of that, Anne of Cleves became a strange kind of symbol. A symbol of quiet existence, of patience, of a woman who did not need love to survive, but was never loved enough to be remembered. History often remembers the loudest deaths, the beheadings in public squares, the trials where treason is shouted, the tears shed before crowds, and the cries of innocence buried deep beneath the Tower of London. Anne of Cleves had none of that. There was no blood, no quiescence, no glory, and no public disgrace. She simply lived, and then she died, like a thin wisp of smoke, disappearing quietly within the vast halls of the palace. No one speaks her name among the list of unforgettable queens. No one ever asked, after Anne Boleyn's bloody fall, after Jane Seymour's quiet death, after Catherine Howard's final trial, was there someone who walked silently among those shadows and never said a word? If Anne Boleyn was the symbol of defiance, if Catherine Howard was the tragedy of youth burned too quickly, then Anne of Cleves was the silent witness to power. A woman who did not lose her head, but lost her place in collective memory. She was not a hero. She was not a victim. She was a lingering question in the stream of history. What happens when a woman knows when to step back, to bend, to remain silent, but the world still refuses to open its heart to hear her? More than 500 years have passed. Her name still lies quietly in the pages of history, small, pale, often skipped. But for those who read to the end, and they will understand that some lives are a form of resistance, that some deaths are a way to remain, and needed no monument, no press. She only needed someone to remember that she was once there. She was forgotten because she did not scream, But if silence is a crime, then which one of us dares to say we are innocent? This is where the story ends. The crown still rests in silence, waiting for someone to speak her name one last time. Are you brave enough to speak for her?